I disappeared into the Canadian Rockies on a February morning when the sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on the pines like a held breath. They say I vanished without a trace, but that isn't entirely true. I left things behind: a torn backpack caught on deadfall, a water bottle half buried in snow, and a journal whose pages they found, scattered across 3 miles of wilderness. What I didn't leave were answers. My car sat alone at the trailhead for 6 days before anyone noticed, frost creeping across the windshield like searching fingers. By then, the search parties were already following paths that led nowhere, calling a name that the wind swallowed whole. They never found me. Because I had slipped through a seam in the world, crossed a threshold I didn't know existed until I was already on the other side. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, and I understand why you might not believe me. But I need you to understand that I'm not asking for your belief. I'm offering you a confession, a testimony of something that remade me in ways I'm still discovering. This isn't a story about getting lost. This is about being found by something the world forgot was watching. I had gone into those mountains alone because I needed the silence, needed to feel small beneath something vast and indifferent. My life had become a series of compromises and quiet disappointments, and I thought the wilderness might burn that feeling away, replace it with something clean and simple. The trail I chose was unmarked on most maps, a route a ranger had mentioned years before in passing, a place where few people ventured, because the beauty there demanded too much effort. I remember the weight of my pack, the rhythm of my boots crunching through old snow, the way my breath crystallized in front of my face like small ghosts dissolving. But I also remember the feeling that crept over me during that second day, a sensation I wrote about in scattered fragments throughout my journal. I felt watched, not threatened, not hunted, but observed with a patience that felt older than the mountains themselves. I would stop suddenly on the trail and turn, expecting to see eyes in the shadows between the trees, but there was only the endless white and the silence that pressed against my eardrums. At night in my tent, I would wake for no reason, heart pounding, convinced that something massive had just passed by, close enough to touch the nylon walls. I told myself it was my imagination, that isolation was playing tricks on my perception. I kept hiking deeper. My last coherent journal entry was written on the 5th morning, my handwriting shakier than it should have been. I described a clearing I'd found, where the snow had been disturbed in patterns I couldn't explain. Great sweeping arcs, too deliberate to be wind, too large to be any animal I could name. I wrote about finding a single strand of white hair caught on a branch, thick as twine and longer than my arm, that seemed to shimmer even in the flat winter light. I wrote that I was going to follow the tracks, that I needed to know what had made them, that something in my chest was pulling me forward like a compass needle finding true north. Then the words stopped making sense, devolving into fragments. It sees me, older than names. I'm not afraid. The final page they found was blank, except for a single sentence written so hard the pen tore through the paper. The White One walks between storms. I don't remember writing those words, but I remember the moment I understood them, the moment the ground beneath me gave way and I fell through ice into darkness, my scream swallowed by the crack of splitting stone. I remember the cold that bit deeper than cold should reach, and the shadow that blotted out the circle of grey sky. Above me, something had followed me after all. What happened in the moments after I fell is where memory becomes mythology, where my testimony shifts from the language of rescue into something older and more frightening. I should have died in that ravine. The water alone should have stopped my heart. The impact should have shattered more than just my leg. But I didn't die because something reached down into that frozen darkness and pulled me out with hands I couldn't see clearly, couldn't process, couldn't fit into any framework of understanding I possessed. I remember being carried through a blizzard that had appeared from nowhere, cradled against something warm and massive that smelled like pine resin and stone and centuries of accumulated solitude. I remember gentle movement despite impossible size, and the sensation of being protected by something that had been waiting in those mountains long before humans gave them a name. When I finally opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the world I'd left behind. I was somewhere. Between, held in the care of a legend I didn't know was real, about to begin 4 years that would teach me the truth beneath the myths. The White One had found me, and nothing would ever be the same. 4 years is a long time to be erased from the world, but I didn't experience it as absence. I experienced it as transformation, as a slow unraveling of everything I thought I knew about survival, solitude, and the invisible architecture of the wild places. When I finally stumbled back into civilization, it wasn't because I escaped, it was because I was released, guided back to the threshold, and gently pushed across by something that understood boundaries better than I ever could. The town I emerged into was called Shepherd's Gap, a name I wouldn't appreciate the irony of until much later, a cluster of buildings huddled against the mountains like prayer. It was deep winter again, the sky hemorrhaging snow in thick curtains that erased the horizon, and I walked out of that whiteout like something conjured from folk memory, frost-bitten and hollow-eyed, and speaking in fragments that made no sense to the woman who found me collapsed against the post office wall. She told me later that I kept repeating the same phrase over and over, my voice barely a whisper through cracked lips. The White One walks between storms, the White One brought me back, the White One keeps the forgotten. She thought I was dying, that hypothermia had taken my mind before it took my body. She didn't understand that I was trying to explain the most important thing that had ever happened to me, trying to compress 4 years of impossible truth into words that had no framework for containing it. They wrapped me in thermal blankets and rushed me to the regional hospital, and I remember watching the town disappear behind us through the ambulance window, searching the tree line for a shape I knew wouldn't reveal itself. Not here, not in the world of sirens and electric lights and people who had forgotten how to see. The hospital became a prison of questions I couldn't answer in ways that satisfied anyone, a fluorescent limbo where doctors examined my body while trying to diagnose my mind. Physically, I was a puzzle that contradicted their assumptions about exposure and survival. Malnourished, but not starved. Frostbitten, but without the tissue death they expected. My once shattered leg healed at angles that suggested primitive setting, but with bone density that spoke of careful, prolonged care. They found things in my blood work they couldn't explain, trace minerals and compounds that didn't match any known supplement or diet, residues of plants that shouldn't grow at high altitudes in winter. My skin carried scars from that initial fall, but also marks they catalogued as ritualistic or decorative. Patterns of pale lines across my shoulders and back that I didn't remember receiving, but that felt sacred when I touched them in private moments. They asked how I survived, where I'd been, who had taken me, and I tried to explain in ways that sounded increasingly unhinged, even to my own ears. I told them about the cave, about the warmth that shouldn't exist, about hands that tended wounds with a gentleness that seemed to carry centuries of practice. I told them about the White One, the shepherd, the ancient presence that had chosen to save me for reasons I was only beginning to understand. They nodded with professional sympathy and increased my psychiatric evaluations, adding words to my chart like trauma response and dissociative episode and elaborate confabulation, each term a small violence against the truth I carried. My sister arrived on the 3rd day, and I barely recognized her, not because she had changed, but because I had become someone else entirely, someone who had lived in a different type of time, measured not in hours, but in snowfalls and silences and the slow turning of seasons within stone walls. Maya stood in the doorway of my room looking horrified and relieved and angry all at once. 4 years of grief and uncertainty written across her face in lines that made her look older than she should. We had been estranged before my disappearance, separated by an argument I could barely remember now, something about choices and responsibilities and the different ways we had learned to cope with a childhood that had taught us to expect disappointment. She sat beside my bed and held my hand with a desperation that hurt, and I realized she had mourned me, had buried an empty casket or scattered my memory to the wind, had learned to live in a world where I no longer existed. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked around the edges of my name, and she asked the question everyone wanted answered. Where had I been? What had happened? Who had taken me away? I looked into her familiar eyes and tried to find language for the impossible, tried to explain that I hadn't been taken but saved, that something massive and gentle had carried me to shelter the night I fell through ice into a frozen ravine, that I had spent 4 years learning to see the world the way the mountains themselves see it, patient, vast, indifferent to human time. Maya's face shifted through emotions too quickly to name, and I watched her decide in real time that I was broken, that trauma had rewritten my memories into mythology, that the sister she'd lost was still lost in some fundamental way. But I wasn't broken. I was changed, remade by an encounter that existed outside the vocabulary of rescue or captivity, beyond the binary of civilization and wilderness. As Maya sat beside me trying to reconcile the person I'd become with the person she remembered, I felt the weight of the carved stone in my pocket, hidden from the doctors and their instruments, warm against my hip like a kept promise. I hadn't told anyone about it yet, this final gift pressed into my palm in the moments before the shepherd vanished back into the white, and I wouldn't tell them now. Some truths are too large for institutions, too sacred for skepticism, too important to be dissected under fluorescent lights by people who have forgotten that the world still holds mysteries worth protecting, so I let them think what they needed to. Let them build their comfortable explanations around my survival, while I guarded the reality that pulsed against my body like a second heartbeat. The White One had returned me to my kind, had fulfilled some ancient obligation I was only beginning to comprehend, and now I had to learn how to carry that knowledge in a world that no longer believed such things were possible. Outside the hospital window, fresh snow was beginning to fall, and I wondered if somewhere in those distant peaks the shepherd was watching the same storm, remembering the human it had chosen to save, keeping vigil over mysteries that predated names. The nights were worst for explanation when the hospital lights dimmed and the medical staff rotated shifts, leaving me alone with the fluorescent hum and the impossible task of making my survival sound reasonable to people who had never felt the breath of something ancient against their skin. Maya returned each evening with the persistence of grief, bringing fresh clothes I no longer knew how to wear, and questions wrapped in concern that felt like accusation. And I understood that she needed a story she could metabolize. Abduction, amnesia, some trauma that fit existing templates of disappeared women found wandering. But how could I explain waking in darkness so complete it had texture, my legs screaming with a pain that meant shattered bone and torn tissue, the taste of blood and ice water in my mouth, and then the awareness of being moved, carried with impossible gentleness through spaces I couldn't see? How could I describe hands that felt wrong in their proportions, too large and too careful, lifting me as though I weighed nothing, as though I were something precious and fragile that had fallen from a great height? The authorities wanted timelines and descriptions, physical evidence of captivity, but I had only sense memories that defied their frameworks. The smell of mineral earth and something like cedar but older, the sensation of warmth that came from below rather than above, the understanding that whatever held me was choosing mercy over abandonment in ways that transcended language. When I tried to explain that something massive had saved me that night, that I would have died in that ravine if not for intervention that existed outside human agency, I watched their faces perform the calculations of disbelief, measuring my words against their assumptions about what was possible in these mountains. The flashbacks arrived without warning, triggered by sensations the hospital couldn't control. The smell of the kitchen's herbal tea, the texture of the cotton blankets, the particular quality of shadow in early morning, and suddenly I would be back in that first awakening, opening my eyes to firelight dancing across stone walls that curved like the interior of a living thing. The cave had been vast, its dimensions unclear in the flickering illumination, but I remember the immediate awareness of warmth, impossible warmth, rising from fissures in the rock floor, where steam carrying the sulphur smell of deep earth pooled in the cold air. My leg had been positioned carefully, splinted with branches I didn't recognize, and wrapped in layers of what I would later understand was moss, packed with such precision that it seemed less like first aid and more like ceremony, like ritual knowledge passed down through generations that had no written history. And then I saw it, the shepherd, though I wouldn't name it that for many weeks, crouched in the cave's deeper shadows, massive and pale, its form difficult to pass in the uncertain light, but undeniably present, undeniably watching. It didn't move when I gasped, didn't approach when I tried to scramble backward and screamed at the pain that tore through my ruined leg, just remained still with a patience that felt older than stone, older than ice, waiting for my terror to exhaust itself into something else. When I finally stopped thrashing, when the pain forced me into stillness, it moved closer with motions that seemed deliberately slow, deliberately unthreatening, and I saw its eyes catch the firelight, pale amber, almost white, holding an intelligence that made my breath stop for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Maya sat beside my hospital bed, listening to these fragments with an expression that cycled between hope and devastation, wanting to believe me, but unable to reconcile my words with any reality she recognized, and I realized that the gulf between us wasn't just about the 4 years I'd vanished. It was about the fundamental transformation that occurs when you encounter something that shouldn't exist but does. Something that chooses to save you for reasons that have nothing to do with human logic or mercy as we understand it. I tried to describe how the shepherd had tended to me in those first days, bringing water in containers I couldn't identify, offering food that my starving body accepted without question, roots, dried meat, things gathered from places I couldn't imagine. I told her about the poultices it prepared, crushing plants with hands that seemed to know their properties without hesitation, applying them to my leg with a care that suggested this was not the first time it had mended broken things, broken humans, across whatever expanse of time it had walked these mountains. Maya wanted to know if it spoke, if it hurt me, if I was held against my will, but these questions missed the essential strangeness of what had occurred. The shepherd didn't communicate in language, but I was never confused about its intentions, never felt the particular fear that comes from human captivity, only the profound disorientation of being cared for by something I had no framework for understanding. The doctors brought in a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma, a kind woman with gray-threaded hair who asked gentle questions designed to excavate the truth she assumed I was burying beneath delusion, and I found myself describing things I hadn't meant to share. How the shepherd would sit near the cave entrance during storms, its massive shoulders blocking the wind, and make sounds that weren't quite language but carried the weight of sorrow, of remembering, as though the weather itself was a trigger for some ancient grief it couldn't escape. I told her about waking in the night to find it arranging stones in patterns I didn't recognize, or touching the cave paintings that covered the deeper walls with something like reverence, like prayer, its pale fingers tracing images of figures that resembled its own form. She nodded, and made notes, and asked if I understood that the mind creates narratives to protect itself from unbearable realities, that survivors of extreme isolation often develop elaborate companion fantasies to cope with the horror of their circumstances. But I hadn't been isolated. I'd been accompanied, witnessed, tended by something that had chosen to bear the burden of my survival, and the difference between those experiences was everything, was the gap between madness and transformation, between breaking and being carefully, deliberately remade. The language between us developed in increments so small I didn't recognize I was learning until I understood, until the shepherd's postures and gestures carried meaning that bypassed words entirely and arrived as pure comprehension in some part of my brain that had been dormant my entire life. It began with the simplest exchanges, the tilt of its massive head that meant drink this, rest now, the particular way it would position itself between my sleeping place and the cave mouth that communicated protection without possessiveness, the low, resonant sound it made deep in its chest when I managed to stand on my healing leg that I recognized as approval, as something like pride. I started to notice patterns in its absences, how it would leave at dawn and return before dark carrying provisions, how it never approached me after I'd fallen asleep, but would be there when I woke, maintaining a boundary that suggested not just intelligence, but ethics, a code of conduct older than any human law. The shepherd would watch me attempt to move, to exercise my damaged leg through the screaming pain, and sometimes it would crouch nearby and demonstrate stretches with its own limbs, moving its massive body with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, teaching me without condescension, without the impatience that comes from human frustration. As weeks became months, and my leg knitted itself back together under the shepherd's careful tending, I began to observe rituals that revealed the depth of its solitude, the weight of whatever history it carried in those ancient pale eyes that sometimes watched me with an expression I can only describe as longing, as though I represented something it had lost or perhaps never possessed. It would spend hours before the cave paintings, those images of tall, pale figures leading humans through storms, carrying children, tending to the wounded, and I realized these weren't mythological representations, but records, documentation of a purpose that had defined its kind across centuries of service and sacrifice. Sometimes it would place its hand against the stone beside those faded images and make sounds that resonated through the cave like song, like mourning, and I understood that whatever companions it had known were long gone, that it was perhaps the last of something we had relegated to legend, to campfire stories told to frighten children. I began to respond to these moments with my own presence, sitting nearby during its vigils, and eventually it allowed me to touch the paintings too, guiding my fingers over the ochre and charcoal lines, as though teaching me to read a history my own people had forgotten, showing me our shared past of mountain winters survived only through unlikely alliances between species. The turning point in our communication arrived during a storm so violent the cave itself seemed to shudder when avalanche thunder rolled through the peaks, and the shepherd positioned itself at the entrance, blocking the wind with its body, and I understood with sudden clarity that it was afraid, not of the storm itself, but of something the storm represented, some memory or loss that the weather triggered in its ancient consciousness. Without thinking, I moved to sit beside it, despite my still healing leg, close enough to feel the heat radiating from its massive form, and I began to hum some half-remembered melody from childhood that my mother used to sing during Michigan thunderstorms when I was small and frightened. The shepherd went utterly still, and then slowly, carefully, it extended one enormous arm and drew me against its side, not grasping but sheltering, and we sat that way for hours while the blizzard raged, two beings separated by every biological and cultural divide imaginable, joined by the simple mathematics of comfort given and received. I felt its heartbeat through its chest, slower than human rhythm but steady, grounding, and understood that this exchange was the point. Not my rescue, not my survival, but this moment of mutual recognition, of loneliness acknowledged and briefly, impossibly eased. After that night, something fundamental shifted between us, the relationship moving beyond caretaker and patient into territory I still struggle to name. Not friendship exactly, not family, but a Bond forged in the space where language fails and existence speaks for itself, where the simple act of sitting together in firelight becomes a conversation more profound than words could ever approximate. The shepherd began to share its space more fully, showing me the deeper cave chambers where underground streams ran warm and mineral-rich, where crystals caught the light and threw rainbows across ancient stone, gifts of beauty offered without expectation of understanding. It taught me which roots and plants could be eaten, which could heal, demonstrating with patient repetition until my human hands could mimic its gathering techniques, and I realized it was preparing me, giving me skills I would need, though for what future I couldn't yet imagine. We developed small rituals, the way it would wait for my nod before adding wood to the fire, how I would arrange stones in patterns of gratitude that made its eyes brighten with what I swear was joy. The evening hours when we would sit together in companionable silence and I would sketch in my ruined journal while it carved pieces of bone and wood into shapes that looked like prayers, like offerings to gods that had abandoned these mountains generations ago. The seasonal shift arrived not as a single moment, but as an accumulation of changes I tracked through the cave mouth. Longer daylight, different bird calls echoing through the peaks, the quality of snow transforming from the knife-edge crystals of deep winter to the heavier, wet flakes of approaching spring. And with these changes came a visible alteration in the shepherd's behavior that filled me with a dread I couldn't articulate. A sense of approaching loss that sat in my chest like a stone. It began spending longer periods away from the cave, sometimes disappearing for entire days, and when it returned, there was something purposeful in its movements, a new intentionality that suggested preparation, conclusion, the winding down of something that had sustained us both through the impossible dark. I would watch it organize supplies with a meticulousness it hadn't shown before, separating dried meat and prepared roots into specific bundles, and my stomach would twist with the recognition that these were portions meant for one person, rations calculated for a solitary journey I was meant to take without it. During these preparations, the shepherd wouldn't meet my eyes, and I understood that whatever bond we had forged, whatever impossible communion existed between us, it was always meant to be temporary, a chapter in its endless vigil rather than a permanent transformation of either of our existences. The realization that the shepherd intended to send me back crashed over me during a morning when it brought not food but clothing, garments that looked ancient but serviceable, furs and woven materials that suggested decades or perhaps centuries of similar preparations, evidence of other lost souls it had sheltered and returned to the world below. I felt something break inside my chest as it laid these items before me with a gentleness that made my eyes burn, because I understood then that I was not special, not chosen, but simply the most recent in a long line of humans this creature had saved from the mountain's indifference. And soon I would be returned to my species like all the others, expected to resume a life that already felt like a half-remembered dream from someone else's past. The shepherd made a gesture I had learned, meant necessary, important, the same motion it used when insisting I eat or rest or tend to my healing leg, but now applied to my departure, to the severing of this connection that had become more real to me than any relationship in the world I'd left behind. I wanted to refuse, to make it understand that I had nothing waiting for me down there, except questions I couldn't answer, and a sister who had probably already buried me. But the shepherd's ancient eyes held a sorrow so profound it silenced my protests, a grief that suggested it had endured this parting 100 times before and would endure it 100 times again, because this was its purpose, its burden, the shape of its immortal loneliness. We began what I came to think of as departure training, the shepherd leading me on increasingly distant excursions from the cave, teaching me to read the mountain's moods, to recognize the signs of shifting weather and dangerous terrain, preparing me for solo navigation through an environment that had nearly killed me once and could easily do so again. During these expeditions, it would pause at specific landmarks: a lightning-split pine, a rock formation resembling a crouching bear, a frozen waterfall that caught the sun like stained glass, and I understood it was creating a map in my memory, a route only we would know, a path from its world to mine that I could follow. When the time came, some days I deliberately lagged behind or pretended weakness in my leg, anything to extend our time together, to postpone the inevitable separation, and the shepherd would wait with infinite patience but also unmistakable resolve, refusing to be deterred from its purpose by my human strategies of avoidance and delay. On one of these journeys we reached a high ridge where I could see the distant lights of what might have been a town, civilization reduced to pinpricks of illumination against the vast darkness, and the shepherd stood beside me for a long time watching those lights, and I realized it was showing me my destination while also revealing its own eternal exile, the unbridgeable distance between its existence and the human world that glittered so far below. The night before my final departure, we sat together in the cave for the last time, the fire burning low between us, and the shepherd did something it had never done before. It reached across the space that separated us and placed its massive hand over my smaller one, holding it there with a pressure that communicated everything language couldn't contain: acknowledgement of what we had shared and what we were losing, gratitude for the brief interruption of its solitude, even as it released me back to my own kind. I felt tears track down my face. The paintings revealed themselves gradually, as my eyes adapted to interpreting shadow and pigment in the cave's deeper recesses, where firelight barely reached, and what I had initially dismissed as natural mineral staining resolved into deliberate imagery, figures and scenes layered across centuries or perhaps millennia, a visual history preserved in ochre and charcoal, and substances I couldn't identify that glowed faintly in certain light. I discovered them during one of the shepherd's long absences, driven by restless curiosity into passages I hadn't fully explored, and what I found there transformed my understanding of everything, not just my own rescue, but the vast architecture of compassion that had operated in these mountains long before humans built their first settlements in the valleys below. The earliest paintings depicted beings like the shepherd in positions of guidance, their massive forms rendered with reverence, surrounded by smaller human figures whose postures suggested supplication, gratitude, worship perhaps, though the more I studied them, the more they seemed to show something deeper than religious devotion, something closer to partnership or covenant. In one sequence that made my breath catch, I saw a representation that could only be a rescue, a human figure falling, tumbling down a cliff face, and a pale giant catching them mid-descent, cradling them with a tenderness that the ancient artist had somehow managed to convey through simple lines and careful shading. I traced these images with trembling fingers, understanding that I was witnessing evidence of a sacred duty, a purpose the shepherd's kind had shouldered across ages beyond my comprehension. And suddenly, my own salvation became just one verse in an epic poem of protection that stretched back to times when the world was younger and the boundaries between species more permeable. Further into the passage, I found more recent additions, relatively speaking, images that suggested different eras based on the clothing and tools the human figures carried, a visual timeline of rescues spanning what might have been 500 years or more, each saved soul immortalized in pigment, each one a testament to the shepherd's enduring vigil. There was a figure in what looked like fur trader's garb from centuries past, another in the distinctive clothing of indigenous peoples who had occupied these mountains long before European contact, and more recent images, showing hikers with equipment I almost recognized, people from decades that brushed against living memory. Some paintings included details that broke my heart, small touches that revealed personality, individuality, the artist's desire to honor, Not just the fact of rescue, but the specific humanity of each person saved. A woman with flowers woven into her hair, a man clutching what might have been a medicine bundle or sacred object, a child impossibly young to be alone in these peaks, depicted with such care that I had to turn away, overwhelmed by the tragedy and mercy contained in those simple lines. I understood then that the shepherd didn't just save bodies from death, it bore witness to lives, held space for stories that would otherwise have vanished without trace into the mountain's indifference. And this gallery was both record and memorial, proof that these people had existed, had been lost, had been found and tended, and returned to the world that had misplaced them. The most striking discovery waited in the passage's deepest chamber, where the walls opened into a natural alcove, and here the paintings took on a different character entirely. They showed the shepherds themselves in moments of profound vulnerability, massive figures curled in postures of grief, surrounded by symbols I interpreted as representing solitude, duty, the weight of immortal responsibility. In these images, I saw the cost of their guardianship rendered visible, the emotional toll of endlessly saving and releasing, forming bonds with fragile human lives only to surrender them back to a world the shepherds themselves could never enter, watching us disappear down the mountain over and over across centuries of repetition. One painting showed a shepherd touching foreheads with a human figure, the way mine would later do with me, and around them swirled imagery suggesting memory, connection, the bittersweet ache of meaningful goodbye, and I realized this gesture was itself ancient. A ritualized farewell performed perhaps thousands of times, each iteration carrying the accumulated weight of all previous partings. There were paintings of shepherds alone in storms, standing vigil at cave mouths, their postures suggesting waiting, eternal watchfulness, and I understood that between rescues they simply endured, maintaining their isolated stations, guardians without gratitude or recognition, witnesses to human fragility who could never fully join either the human world or whatever society their own kind might have once possessed. When the shepherd returned that evening and found me standing before the paintings, it approached slowly, and for the first time I saw something like apprehension in its bearing, as if these images represented a privacy I had violated, a vulnerability it hadn't chosen to share. But I turned to face it with tears streaming down my face, and made the gesture it had taught me for understanding, gratitude, and then added one of my own, pressing both hands over my heart and extending them toward the creature, trying to communicate that I saw not just what it had done for me, but what it had done for countless others, the magnitude of its sacrifice and the beauty of its purpose. The shepherd's ancient eyes held mine for a long moment, and then it did something I had never witnessed before. It moved to the wall and with careful deliberation began to paint, mixing pigments from materials kept in the cave's recesses, and I watched as it rendered my own image on that stone canvas, adding me to the long chronicle of saved souls, making me part of its eternal testimony. It painted me not as I had been when I arrived, broken and dying, but as I was now, standing upright, holding the walking stick it had carved for me, my face turned not toward the exit but back toward the cave's interior, back toward the shepherd itself, and in that artistic choice I understood it was acknowledging that something had been different this time, that our connection had affected it as profoundly as it had transformed me, that perhaps in all its centuries of rescue it had rarely experienced what we had found together in the long winter dark. The communication that developed between us transcended anything I'd imagined possible across the chasm of species and experience, though calling it language would diminish what actually occurred. It was something more primal and profound, a meeting of consciousness that bypassed words entirely and operated in the realm of pure intention and feeling. The shepherd initiated this teaching with patient deliberation, beginning with simple concepts tied to immediate survival needs, placing objects in my hands while projecting sensations I can only describe as emotional impressions that carried meaning the way scent carries memory, instant and undeniable. When it wanted me to understand danger, I felt a tightening in my chest, a visceral warning that made my body respond before my mind could analyze. When it indicated safety, warmth bloomed through me like sunrise. These weren't metaphors or interpretations. They were direct transfers of meaning that seemed to bypass every cognitive filter I possessed, arriving in my awareness fully formed and impossible to misunderstand. As weeks became months, the complexity increased, and I found myself receiving not just practical information, but something far more unsettling. Fragments of memory that weren't mine. Visions of the mountain as it had existed in ages past. Forests that predated human arrival. Ice sheets that had carved these valleys, and woven through it all the presence of the shepherds, watching, waiting, holding vigil across epochs of geological time. I began to fear what was happening to me, whether my mind was fragmenting under isolation or whether something fundamental about my consciousness was being altered, boundaries dissolving that perhaps needed to remain intact. The visions intensified until I could no longer distinguish them clearly from dreams or waking thought, and in them I witnessed the shepherd's origins in fragments that felt like inherited trauma. Like racial memory, bleeding through the connection we'd forged in the cave's intimacy. I saw their kind when they were numerous, a society of guardians who had chosen or been chosen for stewardship of the thin places where human ambition met natural consequence, the peaks and chasms where our species perpetually tested our limits and found them wanting. They had been intermediaries between human fragility and mountain indifference, protectors who operated in the spaces between survival and death, catching those who fell through the cracks of fate. But the visions showed me their decline, their numbers dwindling across centuries as the world changed in ways that made their existence increasingly impossible. Caught between human expansion that pushed into every wilderness and an ancient duty they couldn't abandon even as it consumed them, I saw shepherds standing alone at their posts as their companions disappeared one by one, not dying exactly, but fading, becoming myth, choosing dissolution over the unbearable solitude of eternal guardianship with no others of their kind to share the burden. The shepherd who had saved me was perhaps the last or one of very few remaining, and the weight of that realization crushed me with grief I hadn't anticipated. I was being protected by something infinitely more endangered than myself, tended by a being whose entire purpose centered on preserving lives while its own kind faced extinction. The emotional exchange grew so intense that I sometimes couldn't tell where my feelings ended and the shepherd's began, our isolation binding us in a feedback loop of mutual recognition that felt both sacred and dangerous, as if we were violating some fundamental law about the separation that should exist between such different forms of consciousness. I would sit by the fire and feel waves of its sorrow washing through me, centuries of accumulated grief for all the humans it had saved and released, the brief connections formed and severed, the knowledge that every rescue ended in abandonment as it returned the healed person to a world that would never acknowledge what had transpired in these hidden places. It had endured this cycle, perhaps hundreds of times, and the loneliness embedded in that pattern was so profound, it sometimes left me gasping, drowning in empathy for a suffering that predated nations. But I also felt something else emerging in our exchange, something the shepherd seemed both drawn to and frightened by, the possibility that this time might be different, that I might choose to stay, to become something other than another temporary charge, to be healed and released. And I realized with dawning horror that this temptation was itself a danger. If I stayed, I would eventually age and die, leaving the shepherd to mourn not just another rescued human, but something closer to a companion, deepening rather than easing its cosmic solitude. And I understood that my remaining would be an act of cruelty disguised as devotion. The crisis point arrived during a particularly violent storm, when the emotional connection between us became so permeable that I experienced something I still struggle to articulate. I felt the shepherd's perspective directly, saw myself through its ancient eyes, and understood with devastating clarity how I appeared to it, impossibly fragile and heartbreakingly temporary. A spark of warmth in its endless winter, precious exactly because I couldn't last. In that moment of total transparency, I felt its temptation to keep me, to let me remain in the cave indefinitely, to pretend that somehow my presence could fill the void its vanished kindred had left, and I felt simultaneously its deeper wisdom, recognizing this impulse as the ultimate betrayal of its purpose, which had always been to return the lost to life, not to keep them as comfort against the dark. The psychic weight of this conflict overwhelmed me, and I collapsed, weeping, not just for myself, but for the shepherd, for the impossible position it occupied, for the choice it would have to make between its own desperate loneliness and its sacred duty. And for the first time, I truly grasped that my rescue had cost it something beyond mere effort. It had required the creature to love me enough to save me, while knowing from the start that keeping me meant destroying everything it existed to protect. The change in the shepherd's behavior began subtly but unmistakably, a shift I felt before I consciously recognized it, manifesting first in the way it started leading me on longer expeditions from the cave into the surrounding wilderness, despite the depths of winter that should have made such journeys impossible. These weren't aimless wanderings, but deliberate lessons, the creature guiding me along hidden routes through the mountains, showing me landmarks I would need to recognize, teaching me to read the landscape the way it did, as a map written in stone and ice, and the behavior of wind through particular valleys. I understood with growing certainty that the shepherd was preparing me for something, transferring knowledge with increasing urgency, and the realization filled me with conflicting torrents of emotion I couldn't untangle. Relief that I might return to the human world, warring with grief at leaving the only being who had truly seen me in my most broken state, and chosen to rebuild me anyway. Each lesson felt like a gift and a goodbye simultaneously. The creature's ancient patience now touched with something that felt heartbreakingly like haste, as if it had reached some internal decision point and was racing against its own doubt. I wanted to tell it I wasn't ready, that I needed more time, but I also knew, with the terrible clarity our connection had granted me, that this was precisely why it had to act now, before our bond deepened further into something that would make separation impossible for both of us. The teaching intensified until I could navigate terrain I would have considered impassable months earlier, the shepherd's instruction bypassing normal learning curves through that direct emotional transmission of knowledge, pouring survival wisdom into me with a desperation I finally recognized as love, the only kind of love such a being could safely express, the act of letting go. It showed me how to read coming weather in the quality of light against distant peaks, how to find water beneath snow, which plants remained edible through winter, how to construct emergency shelter from materials the mountain provided, and underlying every lesson was the unspoken acknowledgement that these skills represented my graduation from its care, my transformation from broken refugee to someone who might actually survive the journey back to civilization. During these expeditions, I caught it watching me with an expression I couldn't decode, using human frameworks, something ancient and sorrowful and proud all at once. And I realized the shepherd was memorizing me, just as I was memorizing these roots, storing up this connection against the centuries of solitude that would follow my departure. The weight of that understanding nearly broke me during one late afternoon, as we stood on an overlook, gazing toward distant valleys where human settlements must exist. and I felt through our bond the shepherd's absolute commitment to my survival colliding with its equally absolute knowledge that my survival required my return, that keeping me would kill something essential in both of us, even as it eased the ache of its isolation. The final preparation came during a period of clear weather that felt like a gift from the mountain itself, a window of opportunity the shepherd recognized with the wisdom of countless seasons observed across its incomprehensible lifespan. It led me on what I knew immediately was our last journey together, a route that descended gradually through hidden passes I could never have found alone, pausing at crucial junctures to ensure I understood the navigation, sometimes placing my hand on specific rock formations or trees as if anchoring the memory physically into my body. We traveled for 2 days, through landscape of such stark beauty it felt like witnessing the world's creation. Just the two of us moving through pristine snow under skies so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch, and I understood this was the shepherd's farewell, this gift of safe passage and shared silence, this final demonstration of the care it had shown since dragging my broken body from freezing water into sanctuary. On the second night, we camped in a sheltered grove, and the shepherd did something it had never done before. It placed one massive hand over my heart and held it there while I felt through our connection a transfer of something I can only describe as blessing, a wordless acknowledgement of what we had survived together, and a protection I still feel in my chest when fear threatens to overwhelm me. I wept openly, no longer caring about dignity or strength, and I felt the shepherd's own grief flowing alongside mine. Two impossibly different beings sharing a moment of perfect mutual understanding across the unbridgeable gap between our natures, knowing we had changed each other in ways that would echo through whatever remained of our vastly different lifespans. The morning we reached the boundary between wilderness and human domain arrived wrapped in the early signs of an approaching storm, clouds building on the horizon in formations the shepherd had taught me to read as warnings of severe weather coming fast. We stood together at the forest edge, where I could see through the trees the distant lights of what must be a town, civilization impossibly close after months of isolation, and the shepherd knelt before me in a gesture that felt formal, ritualistic, heavy with significance. Accumulated across ages of similar farewells to humans it had saved and released. It reached into a pouch I hadn't known it carried and withdrew a small stone, carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the changing light, and placed it in my palm, closing my fingers around it with both of its massive hands while projecting through our bond my final message that arrived not as words, but as absolute knowing. I was to keep this, to carry it always, and through it I would retain a fragment of the protection it had offered, a talisman against the darkness that still waited in the spaces between human understanding. The stone was impossibly warm against my cold skin, and I felt within it a pulse like a heartbeat, steady and strong, and I understood I was holding something sacred, proof that would mean nothing to anyone but me, and everything to the truth I would carry forward. The shepherd touched my forehead with one finger in a gesture of such tenderness I could barely breathe, and then it stood and walked backward into the thickening snowfall, its pale form dissolving into the whiteness as the blizzard descended like a curtain, leaving only tracks that even as I watched them began to fill and fade, erased by wind and snow, as if the mountain itself was protecting its last guardian's secret, ensuring that no one could follow where I had been or find what had saved me. In the beautiful, terrible wilderness that had become briefly home, I stood at that threshold between worlds for what might have been minutes or hours as the blizzard swallowed the last traces of the shepherd's presence, the carved stone burning like a coal in my clenched fist while snow accumulated on my shoulders and the town lights beckoned. Through the trees, with promises of warmth and safety that felt suddenly hollow compared to what I was leaving behind. The finality of that separation hit me with physical force, a grief so profound it drove me to my knees in the deepening snow. And I understood with brutal clarity that I had just said goodbye to the only being who had ever known me completely, who had seen me at my most shattered and vulnerable, and responded not with judgment or expectation, but with patient, wordless care that asked nothing in return, except that I survive and eventually leave. Part of me wanted to turn back, to follow those fading tracks into the storm and choose the shepherd's world over the human. Complications waiting in those distant lights, but I felt through the stone's pulse a gentle insistence that pushed me forward, the creature's will extending beyond its physical presence, still guiding me even in absence. I realized then that the shepherd's final gift was not the stone itself, but the lesson it represented, that love sometimes manifests as release, that protection can mean letting go, that the deepest care doesn't bind but liberates, and that truth resonated through my entire being as I struggled to my feet and began walking toward civilization, carrying that wisdom like a second heartbeat in my palm. The journey into town passed in a blur of stumbling progress through the blizzard. My body moving on, training the shepherd, had drilled into me, while my mind remained suspended between two realities, already grieving the loss of something I knew no one would believe or understand if I tried to explain it in the language humans use for things that matter. When I finally collapsed on a street at the town's edge and felt hands lifting me, heard voices sharp with concern and disbelief, I clutched the stone so tightly it left impressions in my palm, a physical anchor to truth, while everything else dissolved into the chaos of rescue and questions I had no idea how to answer. The hospital lights felt obscenely bright after months of firelight and dawn through cave openings, the antiseptic smells and machine sounds alien in ways that made my chest tight with panic, and I found myself reaching for the stone again and again like a talisman, feeling its warmth and pulse reassuring me that I hadn't imagined everything, that the shepherd was real, even if no one else would ever accept that reality. When my sister arrived, her face a complicated landscape of relief and anger and confusion. After 4 years of mourning me as lost, I saw in her eyes the impossible distance between what I had experienced and what I could ever make anyone comprehend. And I felt the first stirrings of a loneliness different from but equally profound as what the shepherd must feel in its eternal solitude among the peaks. The authorities wanted explanations that fit their frameworks, how I survived, where I had been, what had happened during those lost years, and I found myself constructing a narrative of caves and luck and resourcefulness that wasn't exactly false, but omitted the only truth that mattered, protecting the shepherd with silence the way it had protected me with shelter and care. I saw the skepticism in the doctor's eyes when my physical condition didn't quite match my story, when they found evidence of treatment beyond what I should have been capable of providing myself, the way my broken leg had healed with impossible precision, and I endured their probing questions and psychiatric evaluations with patience, learned from months of silent communion with a being who communicated in gestures and emotions rather than words. At night, when the hospital quieted and sleep eluded me in ways it never had in the cave, I would hold the stone against my heart and feel through it a connection that distance couldn't sever, a thread of awareness linking me to something vast and ancient, still standing watch over the wilderness I could no longer reach. I understood then what the cave paintings had been trying to tell me. The shepherd and its kind were not just protectors of lost souls, but keepers of a boundary between human understanding and the deeper mysteries the world still held, and I'd been privileged to cross that boundary and return, changed in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. As weeks passed, and I began the complicated process of rebuilding a human life from the fragments of who I had been before the mountains claimed and transformed me, I found myself protecting the Shepherd's secret with the same fierce devotion it had shown in protecting my life, understanding that some truths are too precious and too fragile to expose to the harsh light of skepticism and scientific inquiry that would reduce mystery to specimen. The stone remained my constant companion, hidden from doctors and family and the curious. Investigators who never quite believed my sanitized version of survival. And through it, I maintained connection to something that transcended the categories humans use to organize reality into manageable pieces. I caught myself sometimes staring at distant mountains, visible from my sister's house, where I was slowly remembering how to live among people again. And I knew with absolute certainty that somewhere in those peaks the shepherd stood watch, as it had for centuries, patient and alone, carrying the memory of our time together through whatever vast span of existence stretched before it. And I knew that I would carry the same memory through my comparatively brief human lifetime. Both of us transformed by an encounter that defied explanation but needed none. Bound by a connection that asking me to return to my world had only deepened rather than severed, proof that some legends walk among us still, and some of us are blessed enough to be seen and saved by them before finding our way home. I learned to navigate the world again. With the stone hidden against my skin on a leather cord the shepherd had once used to bind herbs together, and its constant warmth became the secret foundation upon which I rebuilt a life that looked normal from the outside while remaining fundamentally altered at its core. My sister noticed the changes first, the way I would pause mid-conversation to touch the stone through my shirt, how I kept vigil at windows during storms with an expression she described as listening, the fact that I could never quite settle back into the trivial concerns that consumed most people's daily existence after I had spent months learning what truly mattered from a being who measured time in centuries rather than hours. I found work as a wilderness guide, unable to stay away from the mountains, even though every peak and valley carried echoes of the shepherd's presence. And I discovered a calling in helping lost hikers and teaching survival, with a depth of understanding that seemed to come from somewhere beyond ordinary experience. At night I would hold the stone and feel through it, not just warmth, but something like communion, a wordless awareness that the shepherd knew when I thought of it, that distance was merely physical, while our connection existed in some deeper dimension where proximity meant nothing and recognition meant everything. I understood finally that the creature had not just saved my body, but had entrusted me with a mission, to bear witness to mysteries the modern world had forgotten, to protect the boundary between what humans could accept and what they would destroy through misunderstanding, and to live as proof that magic still existed for those brave enough to get lost and humble enough to be found. The stone became my compass for navigating questions of purpose and meaning that haunted me in ways they never had before the mountains broke and remade me. And through its pulse, I learned to distinguish between the noise of human anxiety and the deeper rhythms that connected all living things to the ancient patterns the shepherd embodied. I began keeping my own journal to mirror the cryptic entries from before my disappearance. But now, I wrote with clarity about what I had learned. That loneliness was the price some beings paid to maintain sacred watch over boundaries between worlds. That gentleness could exist in forms humans feared because they looked different from our narrow definitions of kindness. That the truest form of love might be the willingness to heal something broken and then release it back to where it belonged, even when that meant returning to solitude. My sister found these journals once and asked with careful concern if I was creating mythology to cope with trauma, and I saw in her eyes the impossibility of bridging the gap between her reality and mine, so I simply smiled and let her believe whatever allowed her peace. But I knew the truth that pulsed against my heart with every beat. The shepherd was no coping mechanism or psychological construct, but a living presence, still walking between storms, still finding the lost and broken, still keeping Faith with an oath older than human civilization, to protect those who wandered beyond the maps of safety into territories where mystery still reigned. Years accumulated like snow over those first footprints that led me into transformation. And I built a life that honored what the shepherd had taught me through actions rather than explanations. No, one would accept, establishing a foundation that funded mountain rescue operations and protected wilderness areas from development that would destroy the last refugees where legend could still walk unseen. The stone never lost its warmth or pulse, and I came to understand it as something more than artifact. It was a living link, a piece of the shepherd's essence given freely to maintain connection across the boundary it had returned me through, proof that what we had shared transcended the categories of human relationship into something ancient and pure. I never married, never formed attachments that might require me to explain the way I would disappear into the mountains for days at a time, drawn by instincts I couldn't name, to places where I sometimes found evidence of the shepherd's passage, a saved hiker with fragmentary memories of shelter and gentle care, tracks too large and strange for any catalogued creature, caves that showed signs of habitation by something that understood fire and mercy in equal measure. And each time I discovered these traces, I would hold the stone and send gratitude through whatever channel connected us, knowing the shepherd felt my acknowledgement the way I felt its continued presence, two souls bound by an encounter that had saved us both from different forms of dying, mine of body and its of hope that the humans it protected might someday recognize the gift. Now, as I stand at the edge of my own mortality, decades after stumbling out of that blizzard, carrying impossible truth in my clenched fist, I feel the stone's pulse synchronizing with my failing heartbeat, and I understand with complete clarity that the shepherd knew even then that I would carry this secret to my grave, and beyond, that some truths are kept not through silence, but through faithful witness that asks nothing of others except that they remain open to mystery. I have arranged for the stone to be buried with me in a place the mountains will eventually reclaim, returning the shepherd's gift to the wilderness that birthed it, completing a circle that began the moment gentle hands lifted my broken body from freezing water and carried me toward transformation I could never have imagined. The journalists and researchers who occasionally still seek me out, hoping for the real story of my survival, find only an old woman who smiles with secrets in her eyes and speaks of luck and resilience, protecting too the last, what should never be exposed to the harsh light of empirical proof that would destroy wonder in the name of understanding. And I die, as I have lived since that final farewell in the storm, connected to something vast and ancient through a bond that transcends death, knowing that somewhere in the peaks the shepherd still walks between storms, still finds the lost, still keeps faith with the sacred duty to protect, and that my life was made meaningful not by being saved, but by proving worthy of the trust a legend placed in me when it chose witness over eternal anonymity. What mysteries might be watching over us from the places we fear to go, and would we recognize salvation if it came in a form we were taught not to believe in? Subscribe to explore more stories where the impossible becomes undeniable and legends walk among us still.